At my late husband Arthur's will reading, my daughter Serafina publicly told me to leave, claiming I wasn't immediate family. After 43 years of marriage, I just nodded quietly. Little did she know, Arthur had a final surprise for them all. I'm so glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Don't forget to like and share. The heavy oak doors of Mr. Albright's law office felt like a threshold to a different world. One where Eleanor, at 68 years old, no longer recognized her place. She pushed them open, stepping into a somber waiting area, her heart a fragile thing in her chest. Today was the day Arthur's will would be read, a final, poignant chapter in the story of their life together. Her late husband, Arthur, had been gone for 3 weeks, and the grief still clung to her like a shroud, muffling the world around her. She found the conference room, its glass panel revealing 3 figures already seated around a polished mahogany table. Her daughter, Serafina's husband, Robert, and Arthur's mother, Beatrice, a formidable woman of 74, whose sharp eyes had never quite approved of Eleanor. Mr. Albright, Arthur's longtime attorney, stood at the head of the table, sorting through papers. Eleanor offered a faint smile, her gaze finding Serafina, a daughter she had loved and nurtured. But Serafina's expression was devoid of warmth, her lips thinning into a barely perceptible line. As Eleanor reached for an empty chair, Serafina's voice, sharp and cold, sliced through the quiet. You can leave now, Mom. This is between me and my mother-in-law. The words struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. Her hand, midway to the chair, froze. Mother-in-law? Serafina meant Beatrice. But her own mother, who had been Arthur's wife for 43 years, was being dismissed. A wave of profound hurt washed over Eleanor, chilling her to the bone. 43 years of marriage, of shared laughter and tears, of building a home and a family, reduced to a mere inconvenience. She felt dismissed, an unwelcome shadow at the reading of a will that concerned the very fabric of her life. Mr. Albright, sensing the sudden tension, cleared his throat gently. Perhaps it would be best if all family members were present for the reading, Serafina. There are specific provisions that may affect everyone. Serafina, however, was impervious to his professional suggestion. She interrupted him, a dismissive flick of her perfectly manicured hand accompanying her words. Eleanor is not immediate family in this matter, Mr. Albright. This is about Arthur's estate, and frankly, her involvement isn't necessary. She's separate. Her long, pointed nails drummed a soft, impatient rhythm on the table. The implication was clear. Eleanor was an outsider, a distant relation at best. Beatrice, Arthur's mother, leaned forward, a sickly sweet smile playing on her lips. Yes, dear Mr. Albright. Arthur always knew what he was doing. Eleanor can surely wait in the lobby. She'll be much more comfortable there, away from all this legal jargon. Her tone, ostensibly considerate, was laced with an undeniable undercurrent of triumph, a subtle hint of old resentments finally bearing fruit. Eleanor's mind reeled. Separate? Not immediate family? The words echoed, each one a hammer blow. She thought of the countless sacrifices she had made for Arthur, the dreams she'd put on hold to support his ambitions, the unwavering care she had provided him through his final illness. She remembered his last touch, his whispered words of love and gratitude. How could they erase all of that so easily? A fierce, desperate urge to speak, to defend her right to be there, welled up inside her. Her throat tightened, though, the words lodging there like stones. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Finally, a whisper, barely audible, escaped her lips. I think I have a right to be here. It was a plea more than an assertion, fragile and uncertain in the face of their collective coldness. Serafina looked at her mother then, her eyes narrowed with an almost palpable disgust. A short, mocking laugh, devoid of any genuine amusement, escaped her. Mom, you've been living off Dad for decades. You never worked a day in your life, did you? Did you really think you'd inherit anything significant beyond a small allowance? Be realistic. Her words were a public shaming, a brutal dismissal of Eleanor's contributions to their shared life. Beatrice leaned forward, her expression one of faux sympathy. Arthur was always a generous man, Eleanor. I'm sure he left you enough to maintain a modest lifestyle. Nothing more, nothing less. He wouldn't want you to be a burden on Serafina, after all. The veiled accusation hung heavy in the air. Mr. Albright, looking increasingly uncomfortable, tried again to interject, his voice firmer but spun. Mrs. Davies, if you'll permit me, there are specific provisions in this will that require your presence, and indeed active participation. He gestured vaguely towards the documents spread before him. But Serafina, utterly confident in her presumption of what the will contained, dismissed his hint with a wave of her hand. Oh, Mr. Albright, please. You just want to follow protocol. Mom will be fine. She doesn't need to be here for the details of our inheritance. We'll tell her what she needs to know. Eleanor felt a profound weariness settle over her. Invisible, unheard, and utterly disappointed, her spirit deflated. What was the point of fighting? They had already judged her, diminished her. With a silent, dignified resolve, she quietly pushed herself up from the doorway. Fine, she said, her voice thin but steady. I'll wait outside. As she turned to leave, the heavy door still slightly ajar, she couldn't help but overhear Serafina's low whisper to Beatrice, delivered with a smug satisfaction that twisted Eleanor's gut. She'll be fine. Mom's always been dramatic about money. This will probably be good for her. Teach her some independence. A wave of anger, cold and sharp, cut through Eleanor's grief. Independence, they thought this was a lesson for her. Eleanor walked slowly to the waiting room, the polished floor reflecting her bowed head. She sank into a plush chair, its softness doing little to comfort her. From the other side of the closed doors, she could almost hear them, her daughter and Arthur's mother, preparing for what they fully expected to be a celebration of their inheritance, a triumphant division of Arthur's legacy. Little did they know, Arthur had always been a man of surprises, and his final act was perhaps his greatest. Sitting in the quiet waiting room, the distant drone of voices from the conference room a dull thrum, Eleanor's mind drifted back. 8 months ago, the world had tilted on its axis the day Arthur received his terminal diagnosis, a ruthless, aggressive cancer. The news had shattered their tranquil existence, painting their remaining time together in stark, brutal hues. It was a time of raw vulnerability, of clinging to every precious moment. Yet even then, the subtle currents of manipulation had begun to stir. She remembered walking into the living room one afternoon, her arms laden with fresh laundry, only to find Serafina and Beatrice huddled on the antique sofa, their heads close, whispering conspiratorially. Their voices, usually so unrestrained, dropped instantly to a hushed silence as she entered. A sudden, uncomfortable stillness filled the room, punctuated only by the soft thud of clean towels landing on the nearby ottoman. Beatrice, ever the master of veiled intentions, was the first to speak, her voice falsely bright, a little too loud. Oh, Eleanor, dear, we were just discussing Arthur's medical care. Serafina has such a knack for these things. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Serafina, avoiding Eleanor's gaze, fiddled with a loose thread on the sofa cushion. Yes, Mom, it's just, Dad's condition is quite serious, and well, you're getting older, aren't you? This stress, it's bound to take its toll. We don't want you making yourself sick. The words, seemingly caring, felt like a barbed wire fence being erected around her. Eleanor felt a prickle of unease, a vague premonition of exclusion. I can handle it, she protested weakly, her voice thin. I've been taking care of him just fine. I know his routines, his medications. She thought of the sleepless nights, the meticulous organization of his pills, the gentle coaxing to eat, the quiet hours spent simply holding his hand. No one could care for Arthur like she could. Beatrice reached out and patted Eleanor's hand, a gesture that felt more like a proprietorial claim than comfort. Of course you have, dear, but Serafina has so much experience with medical management through Robert's work, and I still have connections at the hospital. We just want what's best for Arthur, to ensure he gets the very best care possible in his final months. The words were coated in sugar, but Eleanor tasted the bitter undertone. It was a polite takeover, a quiet coup. As Beatrice spoke, Eleanor caught a swift, almost imperceptible glance exchanged between Serafina and her grandmother. A look of profound satisfaction, like two chess players who had just executed a winning strategy, oblivious to the emotional casualty in their game. The audacity of their concern for her health and the cold calculation behind it burned in Eleanor's stomach. The irony was a cruel twist of the knife. For 8 months, Eleanor had been carrying the secret, a heavy burden she hadn't dared to share with anyone, especially not Arthur, whose own fight consumed their world. For 8 months, she had been hiding her own stage 2 breast cancer diagnosis. She remembered the fear, raw and suffocating, when the mammogram results came back. The frantic, silent phone calls to schedule appointments, always around Arthur's increasingly demanding chemotherapy sessions. She'd hidden the pathology reports, the appointment cards, the doctor's pamphlets in a dusty shoebox tucked away in the back of her closet, a secret world existing parallel to the public one. She'd undergone her own battery of tests, her own anxious waits, her own silent dread, all while maintaining a brave face for Arthur, her beloved husband. From that day forward, Eleanor found herself steadily, subtly, but undeniably excluded from Arthur's medical conversations. Serafina became the primary contact for doctors and nurses, scheduling appointments and consultations without a word to Eleanor. The once open lines of communication were now firmly routed through her daughter. When Eleanor dared to ask about Arthur's prognosis, about new medications, about side effects, Serafina and Beatrice would exchange those knowing looks, a silent, exasperated communication passing between them. "Don't you worry your head about all this complicated medical stuff, Mom," Serafina would say, a dismissive wave of her hand. "Arthur's in good hands. We're handling everything." Beatrice would nod sagely. "Yes, dear, these things can be quite overwhelming. Best to leave it to those who understand the intricacies." Serafina frequently offered thinly veiled criticisms. "Arthur's in good hands, Mom. You look exhausted all the time lately. Maybe you should rest more." And the implication was clear. Eleanor was no longer capable, her presence more of a hindrance than a help. Eleanor was exhausted, not just from the relentless demands of caregiving, from the emotional toll of watching her husband fade, but from the constant, draining battle to remain relevant in her own home, in her own marriage. She was exhausted from pretending not to notice their quiet manipulation, their insidious encroachment into her life with Arthur. She felt herself shrinking, becoming smaller, as they expanded, filling the space around Arthur with their self-proclaimed expertise. She had fought to keep her beloved Arthur close, to be his advocate, his comfort. But their combined forces, cloaked in concern, had slowly but surely pushed her to the periphery. The bitter taste of isolation was already familiar to her, long before she sat in the waiting room alone. As the weeks blurred into months, Eleanor became an unwilling, pained observer to Serafina and Beatrice's systematic manipulation of a weakened Arthur. His once sharp mind, dulled by powerful medications in the relentless march of his illness, was no match for their calculated maneuvering. They seemed to move with a chilling synchronicity, a dance of subtle suggestions and seemingly innocent inquiries, all designed to chip away at Eleanor's standing in Arthur's eyes, and ultimately at his will. One afternoon, standing just outside Arthur's bedroom, Eleanor overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Arthur, frail and propped up against pillows, listened intently as Beatrice, perched delicately on the edge of his bed, spoke in a low, conspiratorial tone. "Arthur, dear," Beatrice began, her voice dripping with concern, "you really need to think about Eleanor's future. She's never been good with finances, bless her heart. Always so artistic. She'll need guidance, darling. Professional management, perhaps." Eleanor gripped the door frame, her knuckles white. Never good with finances? She had managed their household budget for decades, balanced the books for Arthur's fledgling business in its early years. This was a deliberate fabrication, designed to paint her as incompetent. Beatrice continued, her gaze sweeping towards the bedroom door, as if ensuring no one else was within earshot. Serafina, with her sharp mind and Robert's connections, would be ideal to manage assets, to ensure Eleanor is properly taken care of. The choice of words, taken care of, not respected or provided for, was a subtle yet profound dismissal of Eleanor's autonomy. It implied she was a child, incapable of making her own decisions. Arthur, his eyes glazed with the haze of pain medication, nodded slowly, a faint, almost grateful smile touching his lips. He looked at Serafina, who sat beside him, holding his hand, projecting an image of the dutiful, caring daughter. "Yes," he murmured, his voice reedy. "Serafina, She's always been so capable, so interested. He seemed genuinely touched by their supposed concern, utterly blind to the predatory intent behind their words. Eleanor understood then, with a sickening clarity, their objective. They were meticulously constructing a narrative of her fragility and incompetence, a justification for their eventual control. They were preparing the ground, sowing the seeds of doubt, ensuring that Arthur's final decisions would be influenced by their distorted portrayal of his wife. The memory of another incident, from just 3 weeks before Arthur's death, resurfaced with a painful vividness. Eleanor had been making tea in the kitchen when she overheard Serafina on the phone in the living room, her voice hushed but distinct. "No, she's not adjusting well to Dad's illness at all," Serafina was saying, her tone laced with a feigned sadness. "Honestly, she's becoming increasingly unreliable. Yesterday, she couldn't even remember which medications he'd taken. It's worrying." Eleanor froze, the kettle forgotten. The accusation was a blatant lie. She had a meticulous system for Arthur's medications. A chart, a timer, everything precise. This was a malicious fabrication. "We're just so concerned about her mental state," Serafina continued, a sigh heavy with fabricated worry. Rage, cold and pure, surged through Eleanor. Her hands began to shake, and she strode into the living room, her face flushed. "That's a lie, Serafina. I never forgot Arthur's medication. How could you say such a thing?" Serafina, startled, dropped the phone onto the sofa cushion. Her eyes, however, quickly regained their composure, hardening into a cool indifference. "Mom," she said, her voice annoyingly patient, "you're getting confused again. Honestly, it's been happening more often lately. Maybe you should consider seeing someone about these memory issues." The gaslighting was so expertly delivered, so calmly authoritative, that for a fleeting moment, Eleanor questioned her own sanity. But then the anger returned, stronger. She knew her mind was sharp, despite the exhaustion. In Arthur's final week, their campaign intensified. Serafina and Beatrice imposed arbitrary visiting restrictions, supposedly for Arthur's rest and peace. "He needs quiet, Mom. Too many people overwhelm him," Serafina would declare, effectively blocking Eleanor from spending precious hours with her husband. Yet these restrictions never seemed to apply to them. They were constantly there, holding court by his bedside, offering their comfort and support, while Eleanor was relegated to brief, scheduled visits. "We're just keeping him company, so he's not alone," Beatrice would explain, her voice smooth as silk, as Eleanor watched them from the doorway, her heart aching. They were stealing her final moments with Arthur, stripping her of the sacred privilege of being by his side as he transitioned. The cruelest blow came on the morning of his death. Eleanor, having been encouraged by Serafina to go home and get some much-needed rest, returned to the hospital to find Arthur gone. He had passed in the night, surrounded by Serafina and Beatrice, but not his wife. The pain was unbearable, a gaping wound in her soul. They had denied her that final farewell. As she grieved, a terrible realization began to crystallize. Their actions weren't just about controlling Arthur's care, they were about systematically undermining her credibility, ensuring she would have no voice, no power, no claim over the estate. They wanted to seize control, painting her as an incapable, unreliable old woman who needed to be taken care of by her more competent daughter. What Serafina and Beatrice didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Arthur, despite his weakened state, had been far more aware than they'd realized. He had been listening, absorbing, and understanding, even when his eyes were closed and his words were few, and he too had been planning. The heavy silence of the waiting room was broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights above. Eleanor sat, numb and detached, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to an hour. The muffled voices from Mr. Albright's office, once a low murmur, suddenly ceased. A profound stillness descended, thick and expectant. Eleanor braced herself, half expecting the door to open and Serafina to emerge, a triumphant smirk on her face, ready to deliver some final cutting remark. Instead, a sharp, disbelieving cry erupted from within, shattering the quiet. It was Serafina's voice, but not as Eleanor had ever heard it. Raw, laced with shock and a furious indignation. Papers rustled violently, followed by the jarring scrape of chairs being pushed back with force. "This can't be right!" Serafina's voice rose, shrill and laced with panic. There has to be some mistake. My father wouldn't. Her words trailed off into an inarticulate gasp. Eleanor leaned forward, her heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Mr. Albright's voice, calm and steady, cut through the sudden chaos. I assure you, Mrs. Patterson, there is no mistake. This is the last will and testament of Arthur Davies. Your father was very specific about these provisions. Then came Beatrice's voice, sharp and commanding, tinged with a dangerous edge. Read it again, Mr. Albright. Every word. There must be some additional document, some amendment that explains this absurdity. A brief pause followed, filled with the crackle of legal parchment. Eleanor imagined Mr. Albright carefully turning pages, his unflappable demeanor a stark contrast to the escalating tension within the room. And then he began to read again, his voice clear and resonant, carrying through the thick door. Regarding my daughter, Serafina Patterson, Mr. Albright enunciated, and Eleanor held her breath. While I love my daughter, I have observed with growing concern her treatment of her mother during my final illness. Her neglect of Eleanor's emotional and physical well-being, coupled with her overt preoccupation with financial inheritance, has deeply disappointed me. It is my belief that such a character, devoid of empathy and so transparently driven by greed, is unsuited to the responsibility of significant wealth. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Her eyes widened, tears pricking at the corners. Arthur. He had known. He had been watching. He'd seen everything. The whispered conversations, the cruel dismissals, the cold machinations that had slowly, relentlessly, pushed her to the periphery of her own life. He hadn't been as deluded by medication as they'd thought. He had seen their true colors. Mr. Albright continued, his voice unwavering. Furthermore, the deliberate collaboration between Serafina and my mother, Beatrice, to systematically exclude Eleanor from my care and deny her the solace of my company in my final weeks was an act of profound cruelty, a cruelty I cannot and will not reward. Another furious rustle of papers, a choked sound from within the room. Eleanor could almost picture Serafina's face, contorted in disbelief. Therefore, Mr. Albright's voice resonated with newfound authority. I bequeath to my daughter, Serafina Patterson, the sum of $5,000. This sum is to be held in trust until she can demonstrate, to the satisfaction of the executor of this will, 1 full year of consistent, respectful care and genuine concern toward her mother, Eleanor Davies, as evidenced by regular, positive interaction and support for Eleanor's well-being. A collective gasp followed by a choked, half-sob, half-scream from Serafina. $5,000? She shrieked, her voice cracking with fury and humiliation. $5,000? I'm his daughter. I'm his only child. This is insane. The words were thick with betrayal. Mr. Albright allowed a moment for the outburst to subside before continuing, his gaze likely fixed on the next paragraph. And to my mother, Beatrice Davies, for her role in these distressing events, I leave the sum of $1,000, and I sincerely suggest she use this small amount to examine her conscience, if indeed she possesses one. This time, a distinct crash echoed from the office, perhaps a teacup or a heavy book. It was followed by Beatrice's voice, colder and sharper than Serafina's, brimming with seething rage. This is that woman's doing. She manipulated him. She poisoned his mind against us. We will contest this, Mr. Albright. Every last word. Mr. Albright's voice, for the first time, held a note of steel. Mrs. Davies, I must strongly advise against such an accusation. Arthur was of completely sound mind when he drafted this final will and testament, as certified by multiple independent medical professionals. Furthermore, he explicitly anticipated challenges to his mental capacity and took careful measures to ensure the validity of his wishes. These provisions are ironclad. Eleanor sank back into her chair, a strange mix of emotions washing over her. Grief, of course, was still present, but now a profound sense of vindication, bittersweet yet powerful, began to bloom in her chest. Arthur, her beloved Arthur, had seen her, truly seen her, and in his final act, he had not only protected her, but he had also delivered justice with a precision that was both devastating and utterly magnificent. If you're finding this story as shocking as I am, please make sure to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe so you don't miss a single part of this unfolding drama. Now let's get back to the bombshell revelations. The silence in the hallway was once again pregnant with anticipation after Beatrice's furious outburst. Eleanor, still reeling from Arthur's words, could hear the rustle of papers inside the office. Mr. Albright's voice, now infused with a quiet authority, cut through the tension. Arthur was a meticulous man, as you all know. He anticipated that his final wishes might be unexpected. Therefore, he included extensive documentation of his reasoning, complete with detailed notes about specific incidents and conversations he observed. A stunned silence was followed by Seraphina's incredulous demand. "What incidents? What conversations, Mr. Albright? This is preposterous." Mr. Albright, ignoring her interruption, began to read from another page. "On the evening of February 14th, he recited, I overheard my daughter Seraphina on the phone falsely claiming that Eleanor couldn't even remember which medications he'd taken, and expressing fabricated concern over Eleanor's mental state to an unknown party." Eleanor's knees went weak. The memory, so vivid and raw, flooded back. Seraphina's gaslighting, her cool dismissal of Eleanor's own mind. Arthur had not only witnessed it, but he had recorded it. He had known Seraphina was lying about her, systematically undermining her intelligence and capability. A wave of profound, heartbroken gratitude washed over Eleanor. Her Arthur, even in his pain, had been her silent protector. Before Seraphina or Beatrice could fully react, Mr. Albright continued, his voice calm yet devastatingly precise. "And on the night of March 3rd, while I was resting in my bedroom, I overheard a conversation between Seraphina and my mother, Beatrice, in the living room. They were discussing the possibility of having Eleanor declared incompetent to manage finances, citing her alleged decline. We never said anything about having her declared incompetent," Seraphina protested, but her voice lacked its usual conviction, wavering at the edges. Mr. Albright simply paused, then delivered the crushing blow, quoting directly from Arthur's meticulous notes. Their exact words as recorded were, "We need to make sure Mom doesn't have access to any significant amounts. She's not equipped to handle real money, and honestly, she's showing signs of decline." Eleanor's breath hitched. That night, she remembered it now, with chilling clarity. She had been giving Arthur a sponge bath, her back to the closed bedroom door, and had heard their muffled voices in the living room. At the time, exhausted and overwhelmed, she hadn't processed the insidious intent behind their words. She had simply attributed it to the general, incessant whispers that had become a backdrop to Arthur's illness. But Arthur, her clever, watchful Arthur, had heard and understood every treacherous word. Seraphina's voice, now a strained whisper, broke the silence. "So where? Where does everything go? The house, the investment accounts, the life insurance policies? Where does it all go, Mr. Albright?" Her desperate question hung in the air, thick with a terrible, dawning dread. Mr. Albright looked up from the will, his gaze piercing. "Everything," he announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality, "goes to Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, with the explicit provision that she use these assets to ensure her own health and well-being for the remainder of her life." The world tilted for Eleanor. Everything. Arthur had left her everything, not just a modest allowance, but the entirety of their shared life, their legacy, entrusted solely to her. It was a staggering revelation, a monumental act of trust and love that dwarfed all the pain and manipulation. Beatrice's voice, shrill and desperate, tore through Eleanor's moment of stunned realization. "He can't do this. This is outrageous. I'm his mother. I raised him. Everything I did was to protect the family assets from outside influence." Her anger was barely contained, a raw, exposed nerve. Mr. Albright met her gaze unflinching. "From whom, Mrs. Davies? From his wife of 43 years, who stood by him through thick and thin, who nursed him in his dying days, while you and your granddaughter plotted her removal?" "She's manipulative," Seraphina screamed, her composure completely shattered. "Dad was vulnerable, scared. She took advantage of that. She poisoned his mind. The accusations flung wildly were the mirror image of their own insidious actions. Mr. Albright held up a hand, silencing her. Arthur, he stated calmly, anticipated this reaction as well. He then produced a crisp, sealed envelope from the pile of documents. He included a personal letter, addressed to all of you, to be read at this juncture. Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine. A personal letter, Arthur's final words, beyond the cold legalities, to the people who had claimed to love him but had shown such contempt for his beloved wife. From the other side of the door, Eleanor could hear Mr. Albright's voice begin to read Arthur's final personal letter. It started with a tone of profound sadness, yet firm resolve. "My dearest Seraphina and mother," Arthur had written, "these decisions are not born of confusion or manipulation, but from months of careful observation during my final journey. I have watched and I have seen." Eleanor listened, her breath held captive in her chest. Arthur's words painted a vivid, heartbreaking contrast. He spoke of Seraphina's incessant questions about his investments, her barely concealed impatience during his moments of weakness, contrasted with Eleanor's gentle touch, her unwavering focus on easing his pain. He remembered Seraphina's frequent social engagements, her need to be seen, against Eleanor's quiet hours spent reading to him, her hand always near, her presence a balm. "You treated your mother like a burden," Arthur's voice, channeled through Mr. Albright, resonated with a deep, sorrowful disappointment. "When she was, in truth, the greatest blessing of my life. Her devotion was my anchor, her love my solace." The letter continued, each sentence a carefully aimed arrow. "The provisions in this will are not a reward for manipulation, as some may accuse. They are compensation for unwavering devotion. Eleanor has earned every single dollar, every piece of property, through a lifetime of selfless love and partnership." A choked cry, guttural and enraged, erupted from the room. The door to Mr. Albright's office suddenly flew open, crashing against the wall. Seraphina stumbled out, her face a mask of furious crimson, her eyes wild with humiliation and anger. "This isn't over," she hissed, glaring blindly at the empty hallway, before storming away, her heels clattering furiously down the corridor. Beatrice followed, her usual haughty demeanor completely shattered. Her shoulders were slumped, her face pale and drawn. She cast a fleeting, venomous glance at Eleanor, a look of utter defeat. "He chose you," she muttered, her voice barely a whisper. "After 43 years, he chose you." Then she too retreated, leaving only the lingering scent of her expensive perfume and the echo of her broken pride. Mr. Albright, looking profoundly tired but unyielding, stepped out of his office. "Eleanor," he said, his voice softer now, "please come in." Eleanor slowly entered the room, her legs feeling like lead. The air still crackled with the aftermath of the storm. Mr. Albright motioned for her to sit, then closed the door, creating a cocoon of privacy. "Eleanor," he began, his expression gravely concerned, "Arthur left very specific instructions regarding your financial situation, but more importantly, regarding your health." Eleanor's stomach dropped. Her health. Arthur knew. He knew her secret. The secret she had so carefully guarded. The terrifying truth she had hidden in a shoebox, even from him, to spare him more pain. Mr. Albright confirmed her fears, his voice gentle. 3 weeks before he passed, Arthur found your hidden medical files. The shoebox, Eleanor. He found it. Eleanor could only nod, tears welling in her eyes, blurring the edges of the already hazy room. "He was devastated," Mr. Albright continued, his voice heavy with empathy. "Devastated that you had hidden your stage 2 breast cancer diagnosis from him, but he understood, Eleanor. He knew you always put others first. You always put him first." A fresh wave of grief, mixed with an overwhelming sense of being seen and understood, washed over Eleanor. Her silent suffering, her hidden battle, had not gone unnoticed by the man who loved her most. Arthur spent his final weeks, even in his pain, meticulously researching, Mr. Albright revealed, gesturing to a binder filled with notes. "He left detailed instructions about your treatment, top oncologists, leading treatment facilities, experimental therapies. He found everything, and a comprehensive financial plan to ensure you have the best chance at recovery, the chance he was denied. Arthur, in his last act, had moved mountains for her. He had given her a future even as his own faded. Then Mr. Albright's voice hardened slightly. Arthur also documented Serafina's dismissive responses when he tried, on multiple occasions, to discuss your health with her. He opened another page in Arthur's notes. Here, he describes a conversation where Serafina called you dramatic about health issues and accused you of wanting attention away from Arthur's medical focus. Eleanor closed her eyes, a sharp pain piercing her heart. It was exactly as she remembered. Mr. Albright then read Arthur's final heartbreaking note, penned just 2 days before his death. Serafina, he quoted, when I expressed my fears for Eleanor, dismissed my concerns by saying, Mom's tougher than she looks. She'll be fine on her own. My daughter, my own flesh and blood, could not see beyond her own self-interest, even for her mother. The words were a final, crushing blow. Eleanor cried openly now, mourning not just Arthur, her loyal, loving husband, but also the daughter she had raised, the one who had so fundamentally misunderstood, dismissed, and ultimately betrayed her. Arthur had loved her, protected her, and given her a fighting chance. Her daughter had done the opposite. Mr. Albright, after giving Eleanor a moment to compose herself, leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. Arthur's final explicit wish, Eleanor, was for you to use this inheritance to save your own life. He didn't want you to worry about a single expense, a single burden. He wanted you to focus entirely on healing. Just then, a tentative knock sounded at the office door. Mr. Albright looked at Eleanor, who, after a moment of consideration, simply nodded. He opened the door to reveal Serafina and Beatrice, both looking markedly subdued, their faces etched with a mix of shame and residual anger. We need to talk, Mr. Albright, Serafina said, her voice unusually small. Eleanor allowed them to stay. As they sat, Serafina's gaze fell upon the binder Mr. Albright had placed on the table for Eleanor. Her eyes, still red-rimmed from crying, widened as she saw the prominent letterheads of renowned cancer centers and the carefully organized oncology appointment schedules. A flicker of genuine confusion, then dawning horror, crossed her face. Mom, she whispered, her voice barely audible. What is all this? Eleanor took a deep, fortifying breath. The moment had arrived. I have cancer, Serafina, she stated, her voice calm and steady, devoid of self-pity. Stage 2 breast cancer, and it's been spreading while I've been taking care of your father and pretending everything was fine. Pretending I was fine because I couldn't bear to burden him or anyone else. Serafina's face drained of color, going utterly pale. Why didn't you tell us? She stammered, her gaze darting between Eleanor and the medical papers. Eleanor met her daughter's eyes directly. Because every time I tried to express any concern about my own well-being, any exhaustion or pain, you and your grandmother dismissed it. You called me dramatic. You accused me of seeking attention. You never truly listened. Beatrice, who had been sitting rigidly, suddenly seemed to shrink. She looked ancient, her formidable facade crumbling. Oh, Eleanor, she breathed, her voice filled with a genuine shock that Eleanor hadn't heard from her in decades. We had no idea. You had no idea, Eleanor replied, her voice soft but firm, because you never asked. You never looked. You were too busy looking at other things. A profound silence descended, heavy with unspoken truths and stark realizations. Serafina, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, finally looked at Eleanor with something that resembled genuine remorse. What can we do? She asked, her voice a strained whisper. How can we help? 6 weeks later, Eleanor stood on the balcony of her new apartment in Monterey, the ocean breeze a soothing caress on her face. The vast expanse of the Pacific, sparkling under the California sun, felt like a symbol of her newfound independence and the expansive journey of healing stretching before her. Evelyn Reed, one of the top oncologists Arthur had meticulously researched, had given her an optimistic prognosis. Your chances of full recovery are excellent, Eleanor, she had said, her voice reassuring, especially with aggressive treatment and your positive attitude. Chemotherapy had begun, and Eleanor was responding well, finally, gloriously, prioritizing her own health. Serafina called frequently now, her voice softer, laced with genuine concern. She asked about Eleanor's energy levels, her appetite, the side effects of her treatment. It was a new pattern, one Eleanor cautiously yet hopefully embraced. She also began the slow, delicate process of setting boundaries. "I'm not ready for overnight visits yet, Serafina," she'd say gently, allowing her daughter to come for lunch, but protecting her own space, her own healing. One afternoon, Serafina confessed she was in therapy with Dr. Morales, a specialist in family dynamics. "I'm starting to understand, Mom," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion, "how I became so much like grandmother. Always focused on conditional love, on expectations, on what others could do for me. It's hard to unlearn." Eleanor learned that Beatrice, stripped of her assumed authority and reputation, was isolated in assisted living, her few attempts to contest the will having failed miserably. Eleanor felt a fleeting regret for the woman who had once been Arthur's fierce mother, but it was quickly overshadowed by an overwhelming indifference. Her focus now was her own survival, her own healing, her own future. 18 months later, Eleanor received the news that changed everything. She was cancer-free. Her silver hair, now a soft halo, was growing back, a symbol of resilience and rebirth. Serafina visited that week, bringing a vibrant bouquet of sunflowers, her smile genuine, her eyes bright with unfeigned joy. "Mom," she exclaimed, her voice brimming with happiness, "complete remission. I'm so incredibly proud of you." Eleanor, too, had changed. She had learned to trust her own preferences, to say no without guilt, to prioritize her well-being above all else. Serafina, through therapy, was slowly unlearning those inherited patterns of conditional love and was building a more authentic, albeit still fragile, relationship with her mother. Serafina hesitantly handed Eleanor a letter. "It's from grandmother," she said softly. It was a sincere apology, expressed in regret and fear of losing her place in Arthur's life. Eleanor set the letter aside, unopened for now. Today was not about old wounds, but new beginnings. They walked on the beach, the waves crashing rhythmically, a calming presence. "You're so strong, Mom," Serafina said, her voice filled with admiration, "more resilient than I ever gave you credit for." Eleanor smiled, a genuine, joyful smile that reached her eyes. Arthur's greatest gift, she realized, wasn't just the money or the meticulously planned medical care. It was the permission to finally, truly live for herself. It was the freedom to heal, to grow, and to embrace a future she had almost forfeited.